Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Breakthrough Chats, a show where we talk to people in and around politics about some of the biggest issues facing us. In this episode, I speak to the National President of the Bakers Union, Ian Hodson, about how 12 months on from their election victory, the Tories are betraying the working people, what role trade unions play in the 21st century, and how we can bring people together after a politically divisive period in our nation's history. Hi, Ian, how you doing?
I'm all right, mate. How's yourself?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Can't believe it's only Tuesday.
I know, but every day feels the same now, doesn't it?
Like Groundhog Day.
It is, yeah. Every morning I wake up and it's exactly the same. I mean, life is just a Zoom.
It is, isn't it? Like, obviously we've started this series, Breakthrough Chats, only like a couple of weeks ago, and got plenty more lined up. And it's just like, I feel like my life has been lived on Zoom. And I imagine for yourself as well, with all the meetings you're having to do in your role.
I'll be glad when we get back to seeing people in person.
Won't be long now. Like, with the vaccine now out, we might actually be in a position in, I'd hope that it'd be by like the end of the year, we'll be back to fully normal, but who knows at the moment, who knows? But yeah, no, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Obviously, like, there's been lots going on this week in terms of like, well, not only this week, but since it's the turn of the new year with trade unions and, been a lot going on. But I think we'll go sort of like start from the beginning, really. Like, how did you first get into politics?
Well, believe it or not, I actually started leafleting for the Labour Party when I was 7-year-old in Blackpool. So it's been a few years, you know. I mean, it must have been something about Howell Wilson, probably Mike Yarwood show. Mike Yarwood, wasn't it? He was a comedian back then. He used to do impersonations, and I must have thought he's an all right geezer. But I just started leafleting when I was a kid for Labour Party. And that's basically how I got involved in politics. But I've always, from when I was at school, I was always interested in rights of people, I think, and fairness. And as it happens, I always seem to be a red as well, which obviously helps.
Oh, that's amazing. Like, what? I guess, like, obviously from your childhood going into adulthood, like, how did politically? How did you get more involved? What was it what was your sort of inspiration as well? Was there anyone? Obviously, you said Howard Wilson when you were a kid. What was it that sort of you started drawing inspiration from when you?
I loved Arthur Scargill. I loved Arthur Scargill. Read some stuff around Nye Bevan as well. Obviously, he's another hero of mine. I used to listen to a lot of the speeches. I mean, obviously, at Labour Party at TUC used to come because I live in Blackpool. So I got to see some of the big noises really from the Labour movement, and they used to give some incredible speeches. So when I got the opportunity to go and listen to them, because they'd come down on promenade and give speeches on the promenade, and I used to think, yeah, that's all right. It sounds all right to me, that. So that was my influences really.
And obviously back then, the Labour Party was very much fixed in like its working class roots as well. Did that appeal to you as well?
Well, I mean, when I left school, I mean, the first thing I did was join a union. My first union was NUPE, so I was in National Union of Public Employees. I mean, I did get sacked for trying to start a union when I was a printer. They didn't appreciate me trying to organise the workforce. I couldn't even get the union in anyway, but I gave it a whirl. So I mean, I've always been interested in working people's rights, I think, and I've always been interested in trade unionism, mainly more than the Labour side. I've been driven about organising, against the insecurities and low pay and the bullying and harassment in workplaces really.
That brings us on quite nicely. So when did you start your work with BFAWU?
So I started work with the Bakers Union. I became a shop steward at a place called, what was we called at the time when I joined? Because it's had that many different name changes. So I think when I joined, it was actually still, it's always referred to as Symbols Biscuits. It's now referred to Burton's Foods, which is quite strange because Burton's Foods used to be the other biscuit factory that was in Blackpool. I mean, it's been Premier Foods, it's been Lions Biscuits, it's been all of these different names, but you know, that's where I started working. So like there, 1989 is when I became a member, and then I got elected after I got made permanent to being a shop steward. So basically, since 1990, I've been a steward.
Okay. And then in terms of like, when did you become the national president of it, and like how did that journey happen?
So I became a steward, then I became the branch chair, then I became a branch secretary, became a full-time official for the area, and then I got elected into the position of national president and took over in 2011.
And for those who don't really know much about the Bakers Union, can you sort of tell us a little bit more about it and who they represent?
So we represent right across the food sector, predominantly bakers. We've been here since 1847, so we're the oldest trade union. We started in Manchester in cellar bakeries. We have, you know, we was very, and always have been very committed to a campaigning type of organisation. When we were starting up, it was about health and safety issues because of the nature of the job. The average lifespan of a baker was 34 years old when the union was starting up, and that was because of the health and safety problems that they had to endure on a daily basis. So, you know, the union, like I say, has been around and has been always a trade union that has campaigned around issues.
Well, it's interesting you say it was born in Manchester as well, because like, obviously, you know, my party has been born in Manchester as well. And like, you've had so many movements. You obviously had Peterloo, you had obviously the suffragette movement, and you also had, you know, Frederick Engels as well, coming over to Manchester and seeing the slums here and seeing like how awful conditions were. Do you think there's something particular about Manchester that has that sort of, I guess, origins of like movements and, you know, like a real like working class struggle, I guess, and that fight back against the establishment?
Yeah, probably. I mean, obviously, I can't hazard to think what it was like in 1847, but clearly, you know, it was. It's always been a town that's you know, bred, I think, probably people, you know, hardened people that realised that the issue of class and you know, the need for representation was the only way we could improve and gain the rights that we should be entitled to from birth. You know, I think, you know, we're all entitled to live in a society that's fair and just. And I think the mentality of the people in Manchester probably, you know, pretty much reflects that, as it does, you know, in my opinion, throughout the Northwest, as a Northerner.
I kind of class myself now as an honorary Mancunian. I've been up here for nearly 7 years now, so maybe not quite. I'm still a Southerner, unfortunately. But sort of bringing us up to present day, I guess. And obviously, I'm just going to sort of like talk about a couple of things that have really caught my eye in the news this week. In terms of like the big one for me was obviously the Ferrari around like workers' rights this week. So obviously there's going to be a, you know, post-Brexit review of workers' rights, obviously looking into like the 48-hour working time directive, looking at stuff like the, you know, holiday pay and, you know, other things like that. What have you sort of made of it?
Well, I mean, I think it just confirms the, you know, the reality of what the Tories actually are, and for them, what the opportunity Brexit has provided with them. You know, I mean, we was a trade union that actually campaigned to leave the European Union. So, you know, we weren't lovers of being members of the European Union, but, you know, we didn't also buy into this idea that the European Union was responsible for all our problems either. We didn't believe that migrants are the reason why we haven't got any decent homes or why we haven't got decent paid jobs. We know that the responsibility of that falls quite clearly on the shoulders of politicians and the decisions that they've made, and most of those decisions are bought by the corporations and devised how that's going to work in those boardrooms and then sold to the politicians over a nice lunch somewhere. I mean, so, you know, it doesn't surprise me to see that one of the first things that the Tories want to do is reduce people's pay, force people to work longer hours because it mirrors what they've done with the pensions, and you know, get less in return for the labour you provide. So it's not a surprise to me at all. It's just very unfortunate that some people believe that the Tories would honour that commitment to level up when they absolutely had no intention. And that helps people, you know, either do one of two things: move further to the extremes of politics, or it makes them decide not to get involved in politics whatsoever because they feel so disenfranchised.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you say that, because obviously in the last election in 2019, they obviously said that, you know, the Tories said they're now the party of the working class. Labour have sort of ditched that label and now the Tories are. But don't you just sort of, as we all sort of hazard a guess at the end of 2019, that they would row back on that? And I think this is just like the latest sign that they're clearly not for the working class whatsoever.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I think the 2017 and 2019 elections presented the people of this country with a complete radical reform of our lives. I think the manifesto that Labour presented at both of those general elections, you know, if they'd have been enacted, would have been as life-changing as what the Attlee government's legislation was around the NHS, you know, about providing homes for people, to providing full employment for everybody, so it became the norm. You know, I think that the manifestos of 2017 and 2019 would have done that. Unfortunately, in 2019, you know, the media and the lies and the smears that were used to undermine that message from breaking through, leave us in a very precarious position today, because the reality is they wanted to avoid that at all costs. And we're seeing the result now. You know, this COVID crisis has highlighted how their cuts and austerity agenda has made our NHS not fit for purpose. You know, despite the great work that all of those people do, their cuts have devastated so much. You know, because that's the reason why we have to have lockdowns, because they haven't got enough beds, because they've shut them down. You know, the fact that they've gone for years undermining health and safety, calling it red tape because they said it got in the way of company profits. You know, the fact that we weren't prepared, you know, and didn't have enough personal protective equipment for people to enable us to operate, you know, in an appropriate manner to keep the economy going, you know, shows how devastating, you know, 10 years of austerity has been. And of course, you know, the impact that it's had on people with disabilities, you know, have been victimized, you know, the complete chaos that their policies of division and hate, of course, in the communities over the same years. So we blame each other rather than the people responsible. And I think, you know, the Conservatives have been able to get away with that as well, on the basis that the media just doesn't hold them accountable for anything, mainly because they've got their own mates in charge of it.
That's a very good point. There does seem to be very much a revolving door between media and politics. You know, we obviously see Allegra Stratton is now the, you know, press communications person. It was obviously at ITV. You're seeing like the other way around, where you're seeing Tory donors and former Tory councillor become like, you know, heading up the BBC. There's a lot of, you know, dodgy goings on there. You're absolutely right as well about the fact that, you know, they're not held to account whatsoever. There's definitely like double standards in terms of like how the media will treat, you know, Boris Johnson, for example, and how they'll treat Jeremy Corbyn. Like that's been like, you know, shown time and time again, you know, throughout the last 5 years at least. Bringing it back actually with the Tories, obviously like another thing that's been massive in the news this week has obviously been the universal credit cut. Obviously they raised it by 20 quid a week during the pandemic, and it looks like they're going to cut that by April. What are your sort of views on that as well? Like obviously it's been, you know, a horrendous, well, lack of debate, because obviously Boris Johnson got them to abstain and not even get involved in the debate.
Yeah, I mean, first off, I don't agree with universal credit. I mean, we should provide security for people when they're in a time of need. And, I'm a supporter of social security. I didn't agree with the changes, to the DWP that were brought in by New Labour. I believe that, the system that we had in place actually supported people at the time of need and helped get people back into work. And I think, the undermining of that and the idea that it's a benefit, when it's actually not, it's income that people are entitled to because they pay through their national insurance and obviously through a contribution system. That's the reason why it's there. And so, we've currently got universal credit. That's what they provide as a safety net, but it's inadequate. I mean, and they know that. I mean, there's so many studies that have shown, that it's responsible for poverty, and it's responsible for the growth of food banks. Around the world, they say people have a right to food, and yet in the United Kingdom, we have people starving, and children having to be fought to get a decent, plate of food by a footballer. I think Matt Hancock probably regrets now attacking footballers, saying they needed to step up, because I think Marcus Rashford has demonstrated what happens when a footballer says, "Okay, I'll take that cudgel and let's run with that," because obviously now he's been been awarded with an honour, and he's forced so many U-turns from the government, and probably he will get involved in the universal credit debate and force another U-turn from them there as well, because it's absolutely appalling. Nobody should be worried about how they're going to survive during this COVID crisis. It's the duty of the government. If we've left the European Union on the basis that we'd be better off outside it, then people should be better off outside it.
Well, that's it, isn't it? Now they've got no excuses. Like before, they could use the EU, as a scapegoat. They were using migrants as a scapegoat. They were using, people who were on benefits as scapegoats. But you look at the universal credit stuff, for example, and there's millions of people that are on universal credit who are already working, like people that aren't earning enough and are having to rely on universal credit to top them up. So clearly, as you say, this is a really flawed system. Obviously, I'm probably not old enough to remember what it was like before, universal credit and stuff. Like, how did it work before, and how was it better? How was it a better system before New Labour came in and changed it?
So it was linked to earnings. People obviously contributed to it, and it was recognised that if you lost your job, then you would get an income that enabled you to afford to be able to survive, to live. The difference now is, of course, you have to meet a criteria set by a government that's been created to ensure that the majority of people fail to meet that criteria. There used to be a right for a period of time to that income. You've contributed to it, so therefore you didn't have to beg for it. You was entitled to it. It was your money. You paid it. It was your security at your time of need. And obviously what they've done now is they've made people ashamed. They've made people, afraid to apply for the money that is theirs by rights. And a decent society, doesn't rely on charity. A decent society, treats people equally. And that means providing them with the ability to live.
Well, yeah, again, when you touch on that, the benefit system and how it's changed and stuff, obviously, the decade of austerity, I think that it was predicted that 120,000 people died as a result of austerity practices. And obviously that included the benefit system. And now we look at a government that's now presiding over, the highest death toll in Europe. Majority of these people, obviously, elderly and very unwell, but obviously disproportionately affected in poorer communities. You do start to wonder, what is the Tories' endgame here? Because obviously, you've had this obviously with austerity. You now had this with the pandemic. Isn't it the mask? The mask has already slipped off anyway. But how can people look at the Tories right now as someone who's working class? How can you look at them and go, this is the party for me, when they are their decision making has killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people?
I think the problem, again, it comes back to that issue that, people turn on the television, Channel 4 documentaries, poverty porn, as it's often referred to, paints a picture of it all being the fault of the people instead of it being the fault of the people who made the decisions. We've gone through decades and decades now of blaming for the problems and the state of the country, when the reality is it's the decision makers. It was a Conservative government that sold off the council housing and stopped councils from building. It was the European Union in the first instance that allowed the the Acquired Rights Directive to be brought in across Europe, but allowed governments to intervene, that allowed the introduction of second generation contracts, which cost so many people their jobs. And it's been decisions by politicians all the time that's caused, the difficulties in people's lives. But unfortunately, instead of that being exposed, we concentrate on somebody who might have, overclaimed their benefit, might be working on the side to supplement their handout, because they haven't got enough to live on. But it's society that's creating that. We never talk about, like when we was having the campaigns for stay or leave the European Union, we always spoke about people coming over here and taking up the houses, but we never ever spoke about, the knocking down of council estates to put up, investment properties for the multi-billionaires around the world. We don't actually fill those buildings and leave them empty, instead, so they can actually acquire more income from it, because obviously the value of those properties will go up because of the places that they've been built in. We never have that discussion. We never talk about the freedom of movement for the rich and the powerful that are able to be able to go wherever they wish in the world. We only ever talk about those people that need to migrate to improve their lives and their standing, and to protect their families. We never talk about, the people who are actually devastating our lives.
You make a really good point. Like, I think that's been, how, divide and rule has been the way for a long time. As I think we've talked about this before a little bit when we've chatted before, is obviously you look at in the 80s, it was, benefits claimants, it was, who was targeted and demonized. And then it was, migrants, and then it was the EU. And there's always a new scapegoat to blame. And as we say now, the government are now running out. Like, I'm seeing a lot of right-wing newspapers still saying the EU are doing this, the EU are doing that. And it's like, you can't blame them anymore. Like, you really can't. Like, what we're seeing in these first couple of weeks of, the UK becoming an independent sovereign nation it's a bit of a mess. And, we're seeing you're seeing fishermen, obviously rightly so, very angry with what's been going on. We're seeing food shortages, and we're seeing other bits and pieces. What have you sort of made of these first couple of weeks of, an independent UK?
Well, I believe the problem has been is we haven't planned for being an independent country. I think politicians of yesteryear, would have devised a country that actually worked in relation to making sure that it was able to be a manufacturing country. Obviously, if we were having infrastructure projects, I think it would be built, the infrastructure would be built on British steel, that was made in British steel factories, that wasn't relying on cheap imported steel. It would be manufactured here. And then obviously we would be building our railway and our buildings, and creating, rather than spending all of that money abroad when we need the investment here. I think, we would have been looking at how we renationalise and use that money that we make. So instead of, spending all of our, monies by supporting, the French and Dutch railway networks, for example, we would actually be putting it back into, a British rail network that was supported and funded, instead of the profits being taken out by a few rich individuals who don't actually live in this country. I think, all of those things would have been discussed, debated, and be part of a bigger plan about how we actually recreate an industrial background, because we can't just wait now for McDonald's to come over here and open another restaurant, because very soon there won't be any jobs over here for people to have any money to go and eat in those restaurants. And then what we're going to do, because that's the economy that we have, and that was proved in the reason why in August we had to have the Eat Out to help out, because we had to get people back spending again, so we could, send people back to work and give them some money to pay wages to people.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Like, the service industry is obviously massive in like the 21st century economy of the UK, but we saw during the pandemic, like, as soon as that shut off, we're kind of, in a mess. Like, obviously, I touched a little bit on, the horrific death toll that we've, this government's overseen in the UK, but also from like an economic standpoint, like we've had the worst of both worlds, where we've got a shockingly high death toll and a tanking economy. I think what you're saying in terms of manufacturing, makes total sense. Like, what are your sort of thoughts on the green industrial revolution? Do you think that's a way out of it in terms of building green and like getting ourselves out of it in that sense? Obviously, I've seen a few commitments from Boris Johnson and the Conservatives, but probably doesn't go quite far enough. And I know Labour have touched on it a bit as well.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff that we could actually become world leaders in. And obviously, other than currently being the world leaders in killing our own citizens with COVID, because that's the only thing that he's managed to succeed in actually making us world leaders in. But I think on the green revolution, I mean, when you look at what was proposed, I mean, and it was the most radical green manifesto that this country and probably the world had ever witnessed. What was being proposed in 2019. I did some research, because for some reason somebody thought it'd be a good idea to get somebody from the Bakers Union to talk about future energy supplies. So I did a bit of research, and some of the things that I found out, like some of the places over in Germany where their houses are built and they generate their own electricity, and it's the community that has the preference over the factory. So the community generates the electricity and then sells that electricity that they generate to the companies, and then the companies are actually keeping the prices low for those households, because they're basically paying for their energy, which reduces their bills. Now, something like that we could have used for every new housing project. I mean, we could put 1 million people probably back to work just insulating homes to keep the heat in, because we've got so many, badly in need of homes that need upgrading. There's loads of opportunities to create employment in that sector. I mean, obviously I live in Blackpool, and I'll see the wind on a daily basis. So I mean, the ability to generate, electricity is there, and we have the technology now, and we should be, really investing in it. But we spent years instead trying to invest in fracking because we thought that might be the best approach. But the reality was it was never the right way to go. But we could be the world leaders, and that to me is an area where now, as an independent country, we should be looking at and building for the future, because it's not just about those people who have an idea about what sovereignty is all about. It's about making sure there's a life opportunity for people that come after too. And if we don't provide jobs, decent jobs, and an environment that's enables people to live a healthy life, then it's irrelevant whether we have our sovereignty or not. I mean, most of the villages and towns will be flooded anyway if we don't do something quick.
Yeah, totally agree. Like, I think, it's built, as you say, it's building towards the future. Like, obviously everyone has their own opinion on Brexit and like whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And obviously I think we've still got a lot of time to find out whether or not it will eventually in the long run be a good or bad thing. But it definitely feels like, and we've had this opportunity before. Like, I think obviously people have gone, well, Brexit should now be an opportunity for us to, get to on the world stage and become a bit of a leader again. And, I think, when it comes to renewable energy and, green sector, we should absolutely do everything we can. I know that obviously we were looking at going carbon neutral by 2050, which at the time was quite like a big target, but it feels like even that is already being rowed back on. I saw something about the first underground coal mine is being built for like in 30 years or something. That's now being built in Cumbria. And there's like a few other things that are going on that sort of makes me think that the whole, the green industrial revolution that Boris Johnson was talking about only a few months ago has already been, those promises have already been reneged on.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the people who backs him. People like Murdoch, who was obviously, very heavily involved in a lot of these, fossil fuel companies with lots and lots of shares in them. So it's no surprise that their green credentials aren't real. But like I say, I mean, we have an opportunity, but it takes investment. It takes a bold vision and a realization that things can be completely different to what they are. We don't have to keep accepting this rubbish that we've had for the past 40 years, 50 years.
I think you're absolutely right. I think people have become so accepting that this is just how things are. This is the status quo. Like, this is what we expect to see. Like, nothing radicals are come in and change things up. And obviously, you could argue, over the last 4 or 5 years, we did have that potentially. Like, obviously with Corbyn, and I know obviously you're a big part of help, from your side, like helping that. Like, what did you make of the 2019 manifesto, of like the Labour Corbyn manifesto, and like what did you make of the whole campaign as well? Because obviously it was such a big change from 2017 to 2019. And obviously a lot of things impacted the result. It'd be good to get your thoughts on it, really.
I mean, I thought the manifesto was an incredible, bit of literature, really. I mean, and when people start to read it in the future, people will go, wow, if they'd have had that free broadband, they could have made sure that their schools were safe by teaching their kids online. I wonder why they didn't do it, because that would have helped. I mean, but yet it got, slammed as being, communism. And it wasn't. It was about enabling people. I mean, that manifesto offered a deal to working people that would have raised the standards, raised their ability to live a decent life. It would have put houses back in communities that were so desperately and are still desperately in need of. It would have raised standards of buildings. It would have created a completely different work environment. Some of the things that Rebecca Long-Bailey spoke about, with the electric cars and the ability for people to go and get a car because they didn't own a car, and be able to use it to make them more mobile. I mean, what a different society that manifesto actually offered. Our own pharmacy, that we was going to create our own medical supplies. How innovative is that when we realise that was being proposed, and where we are now in the middle of a pandemic, where we're having to, invest in other countries, to develop it. I know we've had the Oxford breakthrough, but that's a collection of different, private companies from around the world. We could have had our own, if we'd have elected that Labour government with that radical manifesto. I mean, I just think that the problem was with the campaign is that get Brexit done message is all that anybody had heard. I mean, but if everybody had actually listened and seen that the reasons why we hadn't got Brexit done had nothing to do with Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, and everything to do with the far right wing of the Tory party and the ERG. It was Boris Johnson that kept voting down the May deal, because with the Ulster Unionists, they had a majority in Parliament, and it was Boris Johnson and his crew that stopped that deal from going through. It wasn't the Labour Party or the Liberal Party or all of those other parties put together. It was Boris Johnson and the ERG that stopped that Brexit deal, and it was all about him, getting his opportunity to become leader of the Conservative Party. And to me, that is the reality of the reason why we didn't get Brexit done, and now we see the chaos and catastrophe that he's brought upon, United Kingdom. It's terrible. And as another prediction as well, I predict that Scotland will vote 72% for the SNP, and they'll have a referendum, and they'll leave the United Kingdom. There's a bold prediction.
I think I'd even go one step further in. I'd probably say Wales won't be too far behind at this rate, if I'm perfectly honest with you. Like, that campaign is growing in, growing in stature, and it might not be as soon as Scotland. I think, we could be looking in 5 years, Scotland, really, but like Wales might take a generation, but it definitely does seem to be a massive pro-independence voice growing there, which is just, so it's like, Boris Johnson came in with this idea of keeping the union together, really like a united kingdom. And within 12 months, it's, been ripped apart, really.
It's becoming Little England, isn't it?
Well, yeah, maybe that's what they want. Maybe that's what they want. And like, obviously, who knows, God knows what's going to happen next in terms of how divided this country will be. In terms of so obviously when it comes to the 2019 election, do you think Labour made a mistake in going with the idea of offering a second referendum on the Brexit deal?
I do, yeah. I mean, you could never justify running a second referendum. The people had voted in 2016. They wanted to get Brexit done. They kept telling people very loud and clear by the decisions they were making in elections, and punishing people for not listening to them, and it was a very, very clear instruction that a politician should have adhered. And I do think that the Labour Party's huge mistake was to try and think that they could undo the way that people had voted, and to get themselves in a battle where they became the establishment, and the Tories became the anti-establishment. It's just ludicrous, because the Tories have always been the establishment party. They're owned, controlled, and part of, but Labour managed to paint itself as the beholders of the establishment. I don't know why people perceive that, but that's how it got portrayed, and people bought into that.
Well, it's baffling, isn't it? How, I've read a lot about the 2019 election. Obviously, was keeping a massive eye on it over the course of the election period. But a lot of people say about Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, these are authentic personalities. These are people that you'd want to go have a pint with down the pub. These are people that have got something about them, and they're so anti-establishment. But when you look at someone Nigel Farage, so he was, a Conservative member in the 90s. He was a stockbroker in the city, privately educated, very good upbringing. And then you look at someone like Boris Johnson, again, who's old Etonian, Oxford University, privately educated, very, wealthy background. And you're just like, how are people not seeing this? Obviously, they're positioning themselves, as you say, anti-establishment figures, when they are so much part of the establishment. It's absolutely mind-boggling.
I mean, but that's the media, isn't it? That's how the media portrays these people, because what they do is to provide us with our heroes, and they make these people into heroes. And the reality is they are the representatives of the class that actually wants to oppress us. They are the people that's been responsible, for the hardship that we have suffered, through all of the centuries. They are the same people. They are the same people voicing on their behalf, but in a language that resonates with us. I mean, we don't celebrate in the same way that they do. We don't live the same way that they do. We don't have the high expectations which we should have for our families that they're entitled to for theirs. For me, if the politicians don't represent about improving people's lives, if they don't force the argument that we're all entitled to be able to afford to go on holidays, that we shouldn't have to buy it on a credit card, if they don't fight for the right for workers to have the ability to earn a living without doing excessive hours, then for me, they aren't representing the interests of our communities and wanting to level up. They are just wanting to oppress us and suppress our ability to have a better life and take away the future from our families. To me, the Tories have always represented that, and I just hope that at one point in time we can change people's understanding of how important politics is, because I do think politics is important.
Yeah, definitely. Like, what do you make of, like, at the moment, how do you feel that working people are feeling about politics and how they're feeling about the current state of affairs in this country? Like, obviously, like, Boris Johnson, the Conservatives, managed to win a lot of, like, working class communities votes in 2019. Do you think a lot of people now who might have voted Tory in 2019 would now be reconsidering, or do you think that there's such apathy towards politics, like we're going to see lower voter turnouts? Like, where do you think we are in terms of, like, I think people seem to just be absolutely sick of politics in general. Like, I think, the COVID crisis probably only exacerbated that.
Yeah, I think people are fed up of politics. They were fed up of Brexit and they voted just to get it out of the way. Their desire on politics is probably, not there at this moment in time. A lot of people feel let down. They see the internal wranglings inside the Labour Party. They don't see debates really happening in Westminster where the government's being held to account there any more than it's being held to account in the media. There is no picture of what a better future would look like. And I think, I did a lot of reading on Attlee and how Attlee moved from being, an establishment person, somebody who came from a very conservative background, to becoming a socialist, and how that journey ended up with him, creating the first socialist government in the country. And his means of travelling, his understanding was to recognise the different types of lives that people lead in this country. And he painted a vision that those people could buy into, an NHS that provided, the ability to improve your family's health, a home where you could bring your children up without fear, everybody having the right to a job and, full employment being a reason for people to vote for or against a government. If a government didn't provide full employment, then they should be held accountable for failing to ensure that people have the right to work. For creating a system that enabled people to be able to retire with dignity and free education, through up to a level which enabled them to improve their lives and get proper college and university opportunities too. And I don't see that now being presented to people. And I think that's a shame. I mean, I absolutely detested Thatcher, but she gave a vision of what she wanted. I'm not a great lover of Tony Blair, but people had a vision of what he was looking to achieve, whether you agree with it or not. I think obviously he lost his way, after a couple of years, and unfortunately. But I just don't see the politicians today offering that to people. I don't think people can see anything other than what's going on, and they just don't know other than what they're told, which is actually it's them people over there that are to blame for your difficulty. It's their fault over there. If you haven't got enough money, it's probably because we're giving too much in benefits to them. But I think a lot of people are going to find out as well, because they're going to lose their jobs, and they're going to find out that the benefit system isn't generous. They're going to find out that the support measures aren't there. And all of those stories that they've read in The Sun and the Daily Mail and all of those newspapers that like to encourage people to believe that you can buy 52-inch widescreen TVs on benefits just doesn't exist, because the reality is it doesn't exist. People losing their jobs may have been receiving a redundancy package and gone out and splashed out, which why shouldn't they? It's not the benefit system that's done that. That's their hard work over the years, and the compensation that they receive when they lose a job. But unfortunately, many of these people now won't have those same sorts of redundancy package. Many of them will just get statutory, which is a couple of grand at the most. And because of the 5-6 weeks before they'll get the benefits, means that they will have to use every penny of that just to get them through to pay the debts and the bills that's going to mount up and that is when people, I think, will realise or ask the question, why is it I am not getting the same as what those people that I was told was entitled to in the Sun and the Daily Mail? And maybe that will start the time when they start questioning why they've been left, and the lies that they've been told by a media that presents a picture that wasn't true.
That's a very good point. Obviously, like they've manipulated people so much over the years in terms of demonizing, working class people, and obviously we talked about immigrants as well. And in terms of working class representation as well, I think this has obviously been a massive issue as well, is that, we've had, when you're talking about Attlee, and obviously I know his background was one of, conservative, quite, wealthy upbringing, but, he's obviously transferred over to socialism. But back in the 40s and 50s, Labour Party was a working class party. This was a party that represented working people. And I think it's around, when in the 30s and 40s, it was around 70% of their MPs were working class background. And now we've got a Labour Party that's 8% working class background. You look at the Tories, notoriously, they've always been, on the whole, very rich, very privileged. And you've got a cabinet full of millionaires, billionaires, 66%, 2/3 of them are privately educated. Do you think that's obviously a massive issue, and why probably we're seeing, working people being screwed over so badly, is that we don't actually have anyone representing them in Parliament as well?
Yeah, I do think that's a point. I mean, when you talked before about about Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, most people actually think they come from a background of ordinary working class people because they've learned to talk the language of working class people, and they've been portrayed as being working class. I mean, most people on a Saturday night, if they were going to the pub, right, and they came across Nigel Farage and they didn't know it was Nigel Farage, would tap him on the head and say, "Listen, you're a very angry young man, but enjoy your night," and then they'd move on, because they wouldn't want to spend a conversation with him because he's very angry. You can get you can meet those people on a Saturday night with their abusive attitude. It's everybody else's fault apart from theirs for all the problems that they have in their lives. You can meet them in a pub, and nobody wants to spend time with them. It's the media that's portrayed them as being what they are. But political voices in Parliament have to be representative of the population, and people now, I think, feel further away than they've ever felt from their politicians. They do not represent, in my opinion, the reality of the working class population in this country. They do not reflect our needs. They are not, talking about the problems we have in our lives whatsoever. They don't understand our lives.
And that's a sad state of affairs, isn't it? Because obviously there's going to, you can't blame politicians for some will just, they would have come from a background of privilege, and that's, they can't control it when you're a kid, their parents ultimately will give that wealth and that background and whatever else. But it's empathizing and trying to understand working class struggles as well. You see so many people go into politics now with this idea of, well, it's a really good salary, I can probably be in it for a few years, make some really good friends in the private sector, and then, as soon as I get voted out, I've got a really cushy, non-executive director role in this company. I'm going to do some after dinner speeches. I'm going to make a really good living. And there's not enough people now, I don't think, who are in politics that do it. There's a few people, don't get me wrong, there are a few MPs that I've seen who I'm been really impressed with, but there's not enough of them that are making me go, these people are in it for the right reasons.
No, and that's true, and that is the point, isn't it? I mean, the point is, too many of them are just looking at it as a career rather than an opportunity to make real life-changing decisions. They'll tell you they're in there to make life-changing decisions, but given a choice between do I stand up for the right reasons, or do I do what my donor has asked me to do? Most of the time they'll choose the donor, and to me, that is not representing people's interests. That is representing private finance. It's representing those people who help fund their campaigns. And to me, politicians don't go to Westminster, in my opinion, to act on behalf of private interest. They should be going there to represent the interests of the people who elected them. And they're not donors. They're the constituents. You know, they're the people who live and work in those communities that most of them probably only go to during election times, or when they have to on a night when they have to hold their regular meetings with the constituents.
Absolutely.
It's a Friday, isn't it?
Well, yeah, you see it everywhere. Like, you know, there's like quite a few I know in Greater Manchester that like have been parachuted in from here, there, and everywhere, and you know, aren't local people. They don't understand the area. You know, and we saw it with New Labour as well. We saw it with like, you know, in like the northeast. You know, like Peter Mandelson, like you know, dropped in like the northeast, and you know, couldn't be more disconnected. And that's been, you know, this has been an issue for a long time. In terms of actually like bringing obviously Peter Mandelson and like going on to like the Labour Party. What have you made of the last year or so of Starmer's leadership and what the direction of where Labour's going?
I think the most disappointing thing is I believe in democracy. And I think, you know, the right to be able to make comment, the right to be able to take part in debate is fundamental to a democratic socialist organisation, which is the Labour Party. And so to see that being frustrated makes me concerned over how the Labour Party's direction of travel is currently going. Clearly, you know, we're an affiliated organisation. Obviously, you know, we are currently in the process of having a debate about continuing that affiliation, but we have an historical link with the Labour Party that goes all the way back to 1893 when Keir Hardie first addressed a room full of bakers in London, journeymen as we was called then. And you know, it's you know, it's a difficult time, I think, for our movement, because it is alien to us to not be able to have the right to talk.
Yeah, definitely. Like that's something I've you know, probably the biggest thing is what we've noticed is the stifling of debate and being able to, you know, comment on things that are going on within the party and how people are being silenced and, you know, being, you know, taken out of CLPs. So, you know, like these are big things to happen. And you're seeing a lot of alienation of the left, I think, through this decision making. And I'd be really interested to see what will happen at the next, you know, the local elections later, whether that's May or later this year, because, you know, a lot of the, you know, the left-wing faction of the Labour Party were the activists and the, you know, the organisers and the people on the streets that were winning votes and were, you know, driving the movement. And, you know, we're seeing, you know, a lot more stories about them meeting with like donors and sort of going back to, you know, becoming much more aligned to the sort of Tory way of doing things in terms of relying on larger donors. And, you know, does this signal that they are moving away from, you know, trade union funding and like, you know, more membership, a bigger, like, you know, a wider membership model? It's very like, it's obviously troubling for a lot of people to see.
Yeah, definitely agree with that.
In terms of like, I think as well, what I sort of want to touch on now as well is when we look at trade unions in recent weeks, because obviously I think a lot of people hear, you know, people that maybe aren't into politics or into news would hear like trade union and they'd immediately go back to like the 70s and 80s. They'd think miners' strike, they'd think, you know, like that kind of thing. That's where their mind would immediately go to. And in terms of obviously we've seen, you know, some massive successes with trade unions recently. Obviously, we've seen, you know, with Rolls-Royce at Barnoldswick, we've seen, you know, like the British gas fire, we've seen, you know, the NEU with the teachers and obviously, you know, not going back into school because obviously the dangers of COVID. What role do trade unions play now in the 21st century? Do you think it's evolved since the days of the 70s and 80s, or like, what do you sort of see the future for trade unions involved in politics and, you know, in society?
I think the education unions have demonstrated in recent weeks the importance of trade unions, you know, around health and safety. I mean, they've been right consistently, and it's been a failure of government to act that's created in many instances unnecessary deaths. I think the behaviour of the teaching unions in particular that have been, you know, demonised wrongly by the media for doing nothing more than wanting to protect the children that they have a duty of care for, and the people who teach them. And I think their arguments, and if the government would have listened to their suggestions, then perhaps some of the people who've lost their lives wouldn't have done so. And I think, when we have a review, I think the roles that the trade unions have played in workplaces. We've just had an award, a factory in Greencore in Northampton that's been awarded, called the Rose for Unsung Workers, because of the role that they've performed in raising the issue of health and safety at that factory, where they had a massive outbreak of 300 people being tested positive at one time. And because of their actions and the work that they did, getting the company to finally listen, they've been very, very successful in getting that risk removed from their site and making that a safe place to work. And I think, it's the role that trade unions have actively done in that demonstrates how important one, health and safety is in the workplace, but two, having trained representatives are too. And I think on the issues of how do we build a better world, we build, obviously starting in our communities and in our workplaces by organising and ensuring we get the payments that we are owed for the labour we provide. And I think as we go through to the end of this crisis, it will become more and more important that workers join trade unions to improve their terms and conditions.
Yeah, 100%. I think that trade unions have more of a role to play than ever, really, I'd say, in terms of, especially when you're looking at, the potential, as we talked about earlier, with the Tories potentially looking at how they're going to change, how they're going to deal with workers' rights moving forward now we've left the EU. So it'd be a very interesting time, I think, for trade unions and how they can, as you say, even during the pandemic, the health and safety side of things, like how they can, help workers through this crisis and beyond. My last question for you actually is sort of like a more, I guess, like a sort of message of hope, I guess, because we look at like this country after Brexit, after 2019 election, and I see at the moment a really quite a bitter, quite a divided country. You've seen like glimpses of what we could be like in terms of togetherness, when we, especially in like the first few weeks of lockdown, I think there was a real like community spirit there. How do you think moving forward, politicians or just general communities, how can we bring people closer together moving forward? Because I think I would just love to see like how can we do that? Because it does feel so divided.
I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, there's been years of deliberately stoking fires for political gain and for reasons which are just shocking, really. But I do think in the end that our communities do come together, at the time of need. I mean, I've been doing a lot of stuff for charity recently, and it's amazing how many people donate to charity. It's amazing how many people get involved in raising funds. I mean, you look at the people involved in putting food banks together to help each other out. That's some of the best things that we do as a people, because one of the things that we don't like, and it doesn't matter where you're from in the world either, people will help you in your community. You could have been born here, you might not have been born here, but if you're in hardship and then you're in struggle, then the community will rally around and support you, because those are the best things that we do, and we've got a history of doing that. And once we realise that the strength lies in our collective relationship, we can make a world of difference. And we've demonstrated throughout our history too in this country. We've demonstrated it through winning the rights to vote, through winning the rights on women to vote. We've done it by making sure that, unlike after the First World War, when after the Second World War, we came back and built a country that provided the best health system in the world, that provided the ability to house people, that created the opportunity for people to have employment, that provided a system that gave people support from the cradle to the grave. we can do amazing things when we come together. And when we realise that our strength lies collectively with one another, regardless of where we've come from, that it's solidarity that wins. You know, we can change not just, you know, our lives and the lives of our family, but that of our neighbours, and improve the society that we all want to be part of. So I think it's possible, absolutely possible. And I think we'll do it.
I love that, Ian. I love the optimism. And I really want to see that myself as well. Like, that's what I'm really wanting to do, you know, with the Breakthrough Party. And I'm sure like so many other people out there really want this. And, you know, we've all been on different sides of the debate over this time. And I think now there's a real opportunity to move forward together. Like we've seen, as I said before, like during the COVID crisis, we've seen people come together and, you know, communities come together and fight for the right to, you know, to education, for food, and looking at different issues and like how we can solve them, and like really come together on that. And I think as soon as we realize there's more in common with each other than there is what divides us, I think we'll be in a much better place. And that's a really lovely message, I think, for yourself to end. Like, obviously, what you've ended on there is absolutely spot on. And no, I just wanted to thank you very much for your time today. It's been absolutely lovely chatting to you, Ian. And I hope you take care and stay safe as well.
You too, pal. All the best, mate.
Take care. See you later.